So, want to talk about the big things that need to happen. We're living in a time of unprecedented planetary change. Unprecedented. Nothing like this has ever happened before. There are now more than 7 billion people alive on the planet. We are literally altering the chemistry of the Earth's crust, the ocean, and the atmosphere. We're changing the form of the land itself, its very shape. There was a study that came out almost 15 years ago in geophysical research letters saying that humans are a geomorphic agent. We are shaping the land. The consequences of our management practices for land cause more of the earth to move through wind and soil erosion, wind and water erosion of soil, than by natural processes alone. So we're living in this time where we cannot avoid thinking about what humanity is doing. And we see the consequences of our actions at every scale. We see it in the personal and the internal, as we have spiritual and emotional crises with epidemics of gun violence, domestic violence, depression, suicide, despondency, impulsivity and distractedness, and so on. But we also see it at the scale of our governing systems, that the people who rise to power often do so through corrupting filters. So there's a process of selecting those who will serve systems of corruption as the means to get people into positions of power. So we could talk about corruption of money and politics, lobbying that influences legislation, and all of those things. But more fundamentally, we're at a time where our ability to envision the future has become grim. Now, it doesn't mean the future is grim, it just means our ability to do so is. We're now 3 generations into a period of apocalyptic thinking. So with World War II, we had the bomb. And so then we had the period of popular science fiction and horror and fantasy being about nuclear holocaust, about radioactive monsters. And we had the Cold War, and we had these periods of time where we felt like very powerful, organized groups of human beings were inherently a threat. But then we had the period of global anarchy, which was the collapse of legitimate authority and a decentralization, such that the most dangerous actors are not state-based or government actors. They're not nation states. They're guerrilla tactics of decentralized networks, organized not by locale, but by worldview and by story. So that's where we have things like terrorism, or those who would rig the financial system to collapse and then set up legislation to let them benefit from it, as we saw a few years ago. On the positive side, we see new forms of struggle and new forms of social justice, and we see outpouring of sympathy and compassion every time there's visible hardship, when there are hurricanes and earthquakes, and there are natural disasters of various kinds, and there are wars and bombings, and things like what happened in Paris recently or what's happening in Syria. Living through this time, one thing that we can see is that the world is changing more quickly, and the world is more complex than we humans are equipped to handle. So we don't naturally see the world as emerging decentralized complexity. We don't naturally see the world as being systemically caused. We don't naturally see the world as being accelerating, and we don't naturally see exponential rates of change. And yet that is what is happening. It can be seen. There are ways to see it. There are ways to learn to see it. There is now an abundance of knowledge. In a way, we have too much knowledge, meaning it's more than we know how to handle individually or at the level of our institutions. We're now about 400 years into a period of analytic reductionism, which means that we take real world holistic things and we break them into artificial, simplistic parts because we can manage the simplicity of those parts. So we divide the world into chemistry and physics and biology, psychology, anthropology, sociology. We divide the world into categories so that we can make sense of it. But in putting the pieces together again, we find that we have the problem of Humpty Dumpty. We can't easily put the pieces back together again. And now our institutions, having evolved mostly in the context of this 400-year trajectory of analytic reductionism, which is the rise of modernity, the rise of science and technology as understood in the scientific age. It's largely a Western phenomenon, although it's been exported to the world. And now we need synthesis, we need holism, we need inclusion, we need participation. And so now we need to depend on parts of this knowledge that are more relevant and strategic. So we need knowledge about emotional well-being. We need knowledge about interpersonal skills. We need knowledge about how to work well in teams. We need knowledge about how to critique knowledge. We need knowledge about how to visualize knowledge. We need knowledge about how to tell stories about knowledge. We need knowledge about how to build and improve institutions. We need knowledge of various kinds that are tacit, how-to kinds of knowledge. Like, how do you become a happy, well-balanced person? How do you work well in a team? How do you allocate resources for a project? How do you keep a project on schedule? How do you hold yourself and others accountable? These how-tos are what we need to learn, because the knowledge, the factual knowledge, the information knowledge of that kind is prevalent, ubiquitous, abundant, even excessive. We have so much of it we can't possibly use it all. But in my meanderings across different fields of knowledge and practice, I'm finding that every problem that anyone has been solved by someone somewhere else. Every problem. The one problem that hasn't is applying all of those solutions to our problems. We are not very good at that, and we have to learn how. So that is a task for us in education design, in policy making and governance, in science and research, in the arts, and the creative expressions of humanity. And I hope that we're able to do this. I'm deeply inspired by the human ability to experience awe and reverence, and beauty, to feel compassion and empathy, and to be curious, and to want to know things. And it's for this reason that I think we're going to make it. Not only do I think we're going to make it, but I think the future is going to be better than we could possibly imagine. But largely not for the reasons that we're told about the feel-good stories of poverty reduction or feel-good stories about economic well-being in a time of unprecedented inequality, in a time when more people are starving to death every day than were alive in the entirety of the human race 100 years ago. We're living in a time of great social injustice, great political corruption, and a great misplacing of priorities. What really matters is not what most of us are doing most of the time. So we need to change this. And as always, change starts within. It starts where you are. It starts here. It starts now. So, what are you going to do to be part of the healing process of helping humanity find balance with itself and find harmony with the planet that we depend upon for our survival? And how do we unleash all of that awe, that reverence, that compassion, that enthusiasm, and that curiosity to make the transition that we all increasingly feel deep in our bones is what we must do? And how do we do it together? These are questions and an inquiry that I'm exploring through all of my life and my actions and my work. And I invite you to walk on this journey with me. Let's do this.